Chapter 9. The ride back to the center of Lupercalia was almost hypnotically quick. Casanova's homing instincts meant that the journey passed in an almost indiscernible blur of speed, and there was little to do but let the direwolf run through the countryside while we hung on. "There she is," Tabitha whispered in my ear as the Blueclaw estate came into view. Being a knight and a successful business owner was hard enough, but being a knight who was about to get married had proved to be a far more grueling task than I had ever anticipated in my life. "That was quick," I replied as I pulled back on the reins. We'd spent the night at Sally Ann's again, and even though the journey was shorter, I still felt disoriented. The days seemed to pass in one great blur of speed, violence, and business, and I sure as hell couldn't wait for our honeymoon. If anything, I just needed a break. The long, spindly gates came closer into view, and the majestic claw that clung to them signified that we were about to enter somewhere important. A servant in blue garb rushed out and threw the gate open with a flourish. "Lady Blueclaw," the servant said and dipped his head. "Ugh," Tabitha muttered. "That's what they call my mother." "Well, they're not wrong," I shrugged. "Even though you're about to be Lady Baker." "Lady Baker," Tabitha repeated after me with a dreamy sigh. "You know, I quite like the sound of that. Obviously, I'll always be a Blueclaw at heart. It's in my blue blood after all. But I just can't wait to be your wife, and that's what matters." "That makes me happier than you can know," I said as I brought Casanova to a stop by the steps. "Your direwolf, Sir Henry," the curly-headed servant from our first visit said. "Take good care of this little fellow too," Tabitha instructed as she handed over Prometheus, who oinked with approval. The servant tried to keep a serious expression, but that was almost impossible when faced with an adorable pink piglet that squealed happily in his arms. The man smiled and then quickly turned his head away as he led Casanova and Prometheus to the barn. "Feels like we were just here," I said as I scratched my head. "Forget the whole traveling through dimensions thing. I'm starting to feel confused about the days just being here." "Oh dear," Tabitha chuckled. "That's a sure sign of old age, you know. Or maybe you've taken one too many hard blows to the head from a mammoth minotaur." "You know, we're not married yet," I said. "I could always change my mind." "You wouldn't dare," she declared. The door swung open before I could respond, and a housekeeper in a burgundy dress and white apron appeared. She had bundled her hair under a white cloth, which looked a good deal more fashionable than the hairnets the cafeteria staff wore at my old high school. "Miss Harsham," Tabitha sputtered in surprise. "I didn't know that you still worked on the estate." "Yes, I'm still here," the woman lisped in a cold, unfriendly voice. "Still taking care of everything in this place. I hear that you are to be wed." "Yes, I am," Tabitha replied as she crossed her arms over her chest. It didn't take a mind reader to know that there was a long and undoubtedly unpleasant history between the two women, and I wouldn't have been surprised if it had something to do with Tabitha's wild and tempestuous times in her teen years. "Well," Miss Harsham answered as she looked at me, "your parents are in the back of the house enjoying afternoon tea, and I advise." "Great," Tabitha interrupted and took my left hand. "Come on, hang time to tell Daddy Blueclaw that you met his old foe." I took one last look at Miss Harsham, who was quick to wipe a sneer off her face. I'd never actually met any servants or peasants who didn't like the people they worked for, so this was a first for me. "Where are we going?" I asked Tabitha as she led me out of the foyer and into a long hallway. "To the garden," Tabitha replied. The blue marble floors and walls extended to the hallway, though it was only dimly lit by a few lanterns. It felt like we were walking across an ocean at night, and I was so entranced by the way the marble seemed to ripple in the flickering flames that I nearly missed the various types of climbing plants that had been etched into walls along with their Lupercalian names. "Who did all this?" I asked as I traced my finger along one of the images. "Oh, someone my maybe one more great-grandfather hired," Tabitha said casually. "My tutors actually used it to teach me which plants were safe and which were dangerous." "Wow," I said. "So, can I ask about Miss Harsham?" Tabitha snorted. "She caused me hell when I was a teenager, and she still hates me." "Let me guess," I chuckled. "She caught you misbehaving on several occasions, and promptly reported your misdeeds to your parents. Or as they say in New Jersey, she was a snitch," Tabitha replied. "And to be Honest, it started to feel like she was actually setting traps for me. Like, there was this one time she mentioned that a boy I liked would be joining his father and brothers on a hunt not too far from here. Naturally, she told my parents that I couldn't participate because I still hadn't mastered my history lessons, but she knew I would sneak out if she told me that he was nearby. Okay, that does sound dastardly, I agreed. The scent of fresh grass and dew drifted down the hallway from an open doorway. At the end, and with my wolf hearing, I could also pick out the murmur of voices and old Blueclaw's familiar laugh. We stopped on the threshold so our eyes had time to adjust to the sudden brightness, though Sir and Lady Blueclaw didn't notice us at first. Old Blueclaw was sitting on the left in his human form with his armor on as always. He was leaning back and looking out into the distance while Lady Blueclaw was telling him something about the gardeners and the plants growing in their front garden. So I said to little Herculaneum that there were different types of worms and that some of them weren't as friendly as the others. Lady Blueclaw said. Why didn't you just call it a snake? He grumbled. That child is going to think that snakes are worms, and when he tells the gardener that there's a scary worm in the bushes, no one is going to pay any attention. Daddy, Tabitha sang, and then she ran over to her father. Blueclaw's eyes widened with shock at both of us, and when Tabitha leaned down to kiss him on the cheek, he patted her back and her head like he wanted to make sure she wasn't an illusion. And don't I get a hello? Lady Blueclaw chided as she stood up. Of course you do, Mother, Tabitha laughed as she threw her arms around her mother's neck. But I'm still in my old armor. I don't want to get your dress all dirty and wrinkled. Yes, I was going to say, old Blueclaw said. What happened to your usual armor? This looks like it's for training. Why would you want to wear something so heavy? Oh, you know me, Tabitha mumbled and waved her hand in the air. I left mine somewhere on the estate and we couldn't find it in time, and this still fit. Lucky you still had it, Lady Blueclaw replied as she studied her daughter. Very lucky, Tabitha agreed and smiled. Lady Blueclaw was still suspicious, but old Blueclaw looked back and forth between his wife and his daughter like he wasn't quite sure what was happening. Well, my boy, old Blueclaw growled as he stood up and transformed into his hybrid form in an instant. Your own armor looks quite worse for the wear. Does this mean what I think it does? Daddy, Tabitha laughed. Let him be. He's been through enough these last few days. This is simply unbelievable, he said, and our armor clanked when he hugged me. Unbelievable timing. He pulled away from me and fastened his grip around my shoulders before giving me a good shake. Do you have it? He asked, and he searched my face. The moonstone from the mammoth minotaur. Do you have it? Of course I do, I said and nodded to Tabitha. On cue, Tabitha pulled the blue velvet bag from her satchel and held it up. It's right here, Daddy, she said. Here, take a look. Blueclaw stared at the velvet bag for a few seconds, and then he slowly reached for it. He seemed to weigh the bag in his hand, and then he looked up at us in surprise. It's a good size, he said as he untied the drawstring and tipped the stone into his hand. The glittering band of blue flowed like a tiny river against the milky white stone as old Blueclaw held the gem up to the sunlight and turned it this way and that. There was something hypnotic about it, and I could almost feel other planets and other universes inside the stone. It's beautiful, I murmured. It is, he said and nodded. And it's powerful, as all things of the moon goddess are. Why would the mammoth minotaurs have them? Tabitha asked. They don't even worship the moon goddess. They don't understand the powers of the stone, Blueclaw replied. They think they're pretty trinkets, and because they choose to live beyond Lupercalia, they will never know the true gift these stones represent. But in the right hands. Like ours, I suggested. Yes, Blueclaw said. Like ours. These stones are a gift from the moon goddess, and as her chosen protectors, it's our duty not only to protect those who worship her but such gifts as these as well. It is our duty to preserve what is ours by right. I saw Tabitha grimace slightly at his suggestion that everything related to the moon goddess belonged to the blue bloods of Lupercalia. It's true, Lady Blueclaw added. The mammoth minotaurs have wreaked enough havoc on our society. It's good that this is in the hands of a powerful, eternal protector of Lupercalia. I looked down again at the moonstone and then back at my ring. I knew that the only reason I was in Lupercalia was because of a similar stone that had been imbued with the moon goddess magic, and therefore I had a lot to thank her for. It would have been easy to just accept Blueclaw's declaration as true and forget the whole thing, but I was never one to look away from hard truths. Could still hear Bala's anger, and the sadness that the Marble Clan had felt still clung to us. You should probably know, I said as I tore my gaze from the stone. The chief of the tribe, Bala, recognized Tabitha as your daughter by the way she smelled, and he wanted to get his revenge on you by killing her. Tabitha's mother's eyes widened in fear as she made her way over to her daughter and put her hand on her shoulder. You're all right, aren't you, Tabitha? Lady Blueclaw asked. Of course I am, Tabitha replied. Hank fought in my place. He wanted you to fight? Lady Blueclaw demanded. Like a knight. I took her place, I reiterated. I wasn't going to let him kill her. But, Blueclaw pressed. When he found out I was there on a quest, he agreed to fight me, I replied. As revenge for what you did to him. He said you dishonored him on a similar quest, Tabitha said. And so it was only right that you should lose your daughter and future son-in-law for what you did. It was easy enough to see what you had done, I said and pointed to my face. But his anger seemed to be about more than a missing tusk. You're right about that, he sighed. But it's a long story, so how about you two join us for some tea? Hank, I'm sure you'll be happy to be back in your human form. I shrugged and then shook my head as Charles had taught me. I could feel myself shrinking back to my human self, which I'd done so many times that I barely even noticed it anymore. But at least I'd be able to sit in one of the chairs without breaking it. When Lord Blueclaw and I were back in our human forms, we sat down around the table, and Tabitha's mother gestured to one of the servants who had been hiding just inside another set of doors. Her arm had barely returned to her chair when a delicate silver teapot with 2 pink cups emerged, and a spicy liquid that smelled like Indian chai was poured into our cups. Thank you, I murmured, and the servant nodded before quietly returning to the shadows. As I think I said earlier, Blueclaw began. I was sent on this very quest to win the hand of my dear wife. But as we, as nobles, are aware, there are often ulterior motives on such journeys. What kind of ulterior motives? Tabitha asked as she leaned toward her father. The mammoth minotaurs had been taking shifters hostage, he sighed. Young knights mostly, at least in the beginning. Our pups would head out on their first quest and never return. The king was worried that we were losing so many, so he sent other, more experienced knights out to find out what was happening. They disappeared as well. There are always a few losses when the knights set out on their first quests, Lady Blueclaw sighed. But that year it seemed like everyone had simply vanished. My mother refuses to talk about it, but I've heard stories from my father. So this was before your time? I asked in confusion. Well, before, Lord Blueclaw replied. But we've all heard the stories. Not all of us, Tabitha said. All right, not all, Blueclaw conceded. In truth, things have been fairly quiet with the mammoth minotaur since then, so it's rarely spoken of, as not considered a highlight of Lupercalian history. So what happened? I asked. The king and his counselors finally learned that the mammoth minotaurs had taken the missing knights as prisoners, the older knight replied. And when the king demanded their release, the mammoth minotaurs demanded supplies in return. So you're saying that the moonstone might have been part of a trade? I asked. To get one of the hostages back? It seems likely, he shrugged. It was a difficult time and there was much hardship across the land. Such a dire situation is the only reason someone would have given those non-believers a moonstone. Tabitha's mother nodded in solemn agreement. Sounded like this marriage quest had put me in political territory after all, but I should have known that would happen when I decided to marry someone from such a powerful family as Tabitha Blueclaw. That all sounds very intense, I said. It was, he added. As you can imagine, mammoth minotaurs live for a long time. I know that I look like an old man, but Bala is even older. He was older, Tabitha said with a smirk, but he was no match for Hank. I never doubted he would be, Blueclaw said, and he met my eye. I'm guessing there was another reason you sent me on this quest besides just nostalgia, I said, and I find it hard to believe that you were that desperate for another moonstone. There have been some problems along the border recently, he replied. Why didn't you warn us? Tabitha asked, and she squinted at her father. That's the type of thing that Hank should have known before we left. Especially since Tabitha was going with me, I said. It hasn't been anything that serious, he said. And I knew Sir Henry was more than up to the task. Why give you something more to worry about when you can solve both quests with one swift strike with your moonsword? But what's been happening at the border? Tabitha asked. And why haven't we heard anything about it? Some questing knights got lost along the border, he said. It's happened a few times over the years, but the numbers have been increasing again. 2 of them went missing just in the last few months, in fact, and we assumed that their mission had failed. But one managed to escape, and he told us that the mammoth minotaurs were operating near the border again. It didn't seem very well protected when I was there, I said. But I guess the chieftain knew who we were by the way Tabitha smelled. If we'd just been any old knight passing through, he might have attacked unprovoked before we even knew he was there. Exactly, Blueclaw nodded. And because you took down their leader in a duel, the other members of the clan won't seek revenge. Mammoth minotaurs are a fierce warring society, but they do respect some of the same rules of chivalry and honor that we do. So I guess I did a good thing for Lupercalia, I said. Yes, you did, Tabitha said and winked. Just like you always do. I'll be sure to pass along the news, Blueclaw laughed. I'm sure the king will want to offer you another reward. Of course, there is this moonstone you recovered. There's no way to know now who the original owner might have been. And even if we could trace its origins, I doubt the family would want it back. Too many bad memories. I think I have a solution for that, I said, reached into my pack, pulled out the rest of the tusk, and handed it to the old knight. He looked at his wife, who smiled at me while Tabitha started to rumble her feet with excitement. Oh, Daddy, Tabitha declared. I think it's about time that you added a new protective power to that moon sword of yours, my soon-to-be father-in-law said with a wink. What do you think? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I knew that a moonstone in my moon sword would unleash powers that I didn't even know existed. The most legendary knights all had moonstones in their swords, and the stories were amazing. Had no idea of the exact alchemy that made it all work, I just knew that it was bound to be good. Hell yeah, I said with a laugh, before remembering who exactly I was talking to. Thank you so very much, Sir Blueclaw. It means the world to me that you would offer me such a generous gift. So where will you place it? He laughed and then pointed to my moon sword. I stood up and pulled the large sword out of its metal scabbard. It was still stained with the blood of the mammoth minotaur, and Lady Blueclaw cringed when she saw the greenish-brown mess on the blade of the sword. Oh dear, she muttered to herself. That creature was a monster, Blueclaw added. And it is a privilege to see its bloodshed at the hand of our most precocious Henry Baker. Henry would you like me to show you how to imbue your moonsword with the powers of the stone that you collected? I would like nothing more, I added with a smile. It was true. Now that I knew that I'd succeeded on a quest that was bigger than I imagined, I wanted to celebrate with my prize. The old knight stood up and walked over to me as he pulled the moonstone from the velvet bag. He held it up to the sun again for one last look and then placed it in my hand. You may think that you need tools, he said with a wink, but in Lupercalia, we believe that the moon goddess is the binding force behind all important unions. All things in the kingdom come together and function through her power and her work. So I will instruct you on how to connect the moonstone and the sword with prayer. With prayer? I asked, and my eyes widened in surprise. But it really wasn't a surprise. The prayer had been one of the most important aspects of forging the sword in the first place, so it made sense that it would also be helpful in this context. Of course, he said. Now hold the moonstone in a spot you've chosen. Personally, I believe that the first stone should go right above the crossguard of your sword. It's one of the most powerful places on the sword, and it will offer you a direct connection to the stone when you grasp the hilt. I pressed the moonstone right where he instructed me, above the hilt. It was right behind the head of the Casanova-shaped handle, and I made sure that it was perfectly symmetrical. All right, I said. What now? Do you remember the prayer you used to make the sword? He asked. You'll recite the same one now. Levis Arma Diem, I said. Good, he said. Now close your eyes. Press the stone into the sword and repeat it to yourself in your mind. How do I know when it's done? I asked. Trust me, he said with a low laugh. You'll know. I closed my eyes, cleared my mind as I had done when I'd made the sword, and let myself fall into the rhythm of the prayer. Levis Armadim. Levis Armadim. Levis Armadim. Suddenly a speck of light appeared in my mind's eye. I started to feel a drop in my stomach like I did when we traveled through worlds with the moon ring. Open your eyes, a whisper said. I felt a tingling sensation all over my body at the sound of the voice, and when I opened my eyes, I found that I was in complete darkness. Everything was gone. Tabitha and her parents, the estate, the sound of the birds, all of it had completely disappeared, and I felt the cold rush of the space between worlds all around me. Hello, I called out, and the speck of light that had appeared in my imagination took form in front of me. Levis Armadim, I whispered to myself as the speck got larger and larger, and started to form the shape of a woman. Before I could make any details, the glowing shape before me lifted what appeared to be an arm and pointed at the sword. A crack of silver lightning appeared from her finger, and I felt the warmth of energy as it rushed down the tip of the sword. Suddenly, the weapon lit up in my hands, but it didn't burn me or anything. Instead, I felt a power coursing through me. Somehow, I knew that the sword would always protect me from anything evil, and my body actually began to glow with excitement. There was another brief flash as the woman lowered her arm, and then I was back in Tabitha's backyard. Blueclaw was sitting back in his seat at the garden table and looking at me with a big smile on his face. Whoa, I laughed. That was that. Where the hell was I? Did you guys see that? There was a glowing orb around you, Tabitha said. That's what happened. That was amazing, I said and looked down at the sword. The moonstone was perched perfectly above Casanova's head, and it looked like it formed a halo around the silver dog. The power I could feel in the weapon left me so giddy that I started to laugh. You'll have even more protection now, Blueclaw added. That's one of the most powerful stones there is. Anyway, consider it a dowry of sorts. An early wedding present. So it's a yes? Tabitha asked, and the young aristocrat kneeled down beside her father's chair. You'll let us get married? Let you? The old knight roared, and he threw his head back and laughed. Tabitha, I've known you your whole life, and I know for a fact that it doesn't matter whether I allow you to do something or not, you'll follow your heart anyway. But your heart has led you to Lupercalia's most impressive new knight, and so who am I to protest? Tabitha looked up at me with a grin, and I felt the joy coursing through my whole body. It was time to let the other girls know that a wedding was about to commence, and I could fucking wait. Chapter 10. Once we were back at my estate and Casanova and Prometheus were happily in their paddock, I rushed upstairs to tear off the armor that I'd worn to slay the beast. The servants were wise enough to know that they would have to get in a more experienced armorer to fix this. It wasn't in pieces, but I definitely put it to the test against the mammoth minotaur. Hey, wait up, Tabitha laughed. I turned around on the staircase and looked down at the blonde aristocrat. Even though we were still in our old battle clothes, she looked fucking amazing, so I swooped down, picked her up, and then carried her up the stairs. My lady, I said, I wouldn't want for a girl from the noble Blueclaw family to ever have to touch the ground with her own feet. I'm so glad you said that, Hank, she drawled into my ear, because I completely agree. And as a condition of our marriage, I think it would be only right if you carried me everywhere. No chance, I said as I plopped her on the floor in front of my room. I have too many battles to fight, but I'll do my best in the meantime. The sultry blonde shot me a wink before heading to the girls' closet to get back into her American clothing. I went back into my room and started to remove my armor. The stench of sweat and blood that emanated from the metal made me feel more like a man than I had ever felt in my life, but I set it on the floor to be cleaned and then changed back into the clothing I'd arrived in. I had to admit it felt great to wear jeans after several days inside a tin can. I'd started to feel like a sardine in there, but I knew that it was a privilege to wear the armor, and I was honored to be a knight, even if I didn't always smell fresh as a daisy. As I was pulling my sweatshirt on, I heard a knock at the door, and Tabitha appeared in her Uggs and her yoga pants. Don't let the servants see you in that, I laughed. They'll become suspicious of where the hell I take you girls. They must know something is going on, she shrugged. I mean, I don't know what they know, but they've obviously noticed when we're not around. I mean, you're from somewhere called New Jersey of all things. Here in Lupercalia, nothing is new at all. It's all stock, Yerrick, that kind of thing. Well, maybe we could colonize the forest behind our house in Jersey and make a new stock. I laughed. I bet Sybil would love that, Tabitha purred as she interlinked her arm in mine. Come on. I want to see the look on the girls' faces when they see how quickly it took us to complete that mission. Me too, I laughed, and I felt her brush against me. I couldn't wait to get back to Jersey and fix myself a warm cup of moonbean brew after our long journey, and then the girls and I could spend some time relaxing in the home theater before we had to deal with the next crisis. Just a moment, Tabitha murmured, and she closed her eyes and took a few deep breaths before I activated the ring. Are you going to be okay? I asked. I'm going to be fine, she groaned. Hopefully if Sybil is there I'll puke on her shoes or something. I've always wanted to do that. Well, that's pretty weird, Tabitha. I laughed and I twisted the ring on my pinky finger. It felt like just as soon as we'd arrived at my estate, we were gone again. Everything around us disappeared, and my familiar wood-paneled bedroom became completely black. The only way I could describe it was like being shot out of a rocket. The amount of force coming at me was unquantifiable because I couldn't even make out how it felt. Sometimes I felt like I was moving forward, sometimes I felt like I was being pushed back into a tiny mass. But as quickly as the strangeness wrapped around me, it vanished, and I was suddenly hit by the weight of my own body. The floor appeared beneath me again, and when I looked around I saw we were back in the familiar green-themed kitchen. Tabitha, I said as the blonde aristocrat ran out of my arms and into the downstairs bathroom. MFFF, she said in a muffled voice as she leaned over the toilet. That doesn't sound like fun at all, I muttered to myself. Maybe you shouldn't travel as much when you're pregnant. Tabitha made a sound that could have been a dissent, but it was drowned out by the sound of the witch and the priestess clattering down the stairs. Hank! Sybil's voice echoed throughout the ground floor of the house. I hadn't even seen her yet, but I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on edge. The tone of her voice made it clear that something was wrong, and since the house seemed intact, I had a feeling it had to do with a notebook. Girls, called out. We're in the kitchen mostly. Sybil and Imelda appeared in the doorframe a moment later, and both looked disheveled. In fact, Sybil looked like she hadn't slept in about a week. Her long black hair was oily, and she had dark circles under her eyes. Even though she looked tired, she still managed to resemble a kind of Kate Moss heroine chic model. She was wearing a white t-shirt with black leggings that clung to her long beautiful legs and pink fuzzy socks that I'd put in her Christmas stocking. Imelda, on the other hand, was wearing a black sweatshirt and jeans. I'd never ever seen the pale, white-haired priestess dressed so casually, and it was almost a shock to the system. Her blue eyes glimmered against her pale complexion and white hair, and she looked like a goth who'd wandered into a Prada store. Hank, Imelda said as she brought her hands to her mouth. Her voice was shaking, and she was clearly upset by whatever news they wanted to share. Is everything okay? I asked as I moved toward them. Tabitha, of course, chose that moment to burst out of the bathroom and skip into the kitchen. Hello, ladies, she laughed as she twirled around the counter and the kitchen table. And boy, do I have news for you. Sybil, show me some love. Because not only are you going to be the new Mrs. Baker, but so am I. The girls looked on in horror as Tabitha danced around and hummed to herself. Tabitha, Sybil said, and the blonde noblewoman held her hand up in a shush motion. No, she laughed. You already had your moment. But now it's my turn. Oh, Sybil, why won't you dance with me? You love to dance. Tabitha, this is serious, I said as I looked at Sybil and Imelda. Something's wrong. The young noblewoman stopped twirling and finally turned her attention to the other girls. Oh my, she murmured as she took them in. You two look like shit. Whatever, Sybil grumbled, and she took my hands and stared up at me with her glowing green eyes. Hank, we have a very bad situation going on here. We were so worried that you wouldn't get back in time. I even started to try and think of ways to get to Lupercalia by myself. Imelda added, praying can get you so far, but we didn't know where on the border you two would be. What's going on? I finally asked. Guys, this sounds really intense. Is this about the notebook you were studying? Both girls shook their heads, and Sybil pulled her hands away from mine and pointed outside. Oh, thank God, I said inside in relief. You two had me going. Did something happen with the alarm system then? No, she answered. But I think we're being watched. Watched? Tabitha asked, and the blonde noblewoman covered her mouth with her hands in shock. What do you mean? By who? Wait, I said as I tried to get control of the hysteria around me. Let's sit at the dining table. We need to calm down and make some sense out of whatever is happening after you tell me literally everything. The girls nodded, and we all headed into the dining room. I pulled out a chair at the head of the table, but before I could sit down, Tabitha plopped into the seat and smiled at me. Thank you, she said sweetly, and she batted her eyelashes. You're becoming such a gentleman, Hank. Okay. I laughed, and I pulled out the seat next to her and sat down. Sybil and Imelda sat opposite me and set their hands on the table like they were about to offer me some kind of business deal. It looked like a sexy version of The Godfather, though the women looked more terrified at the moment than terrifying. So here's the situation, Imelda said in her light, ethereal voice. We were foraging for the first flowers of the coming spring. Of course you were, Tabitha smirked. The changing of seasons is a pivotal time for alchemy, Sybil added as she shot the noblewoman a stern look. But I heard a rustling in the distance. First I thought it was a deer, and we decided to follow it a little. I'm guessing it wasn't a deer, Tabitha said. What was it? I asked. Did you see? It was far away, Sybil said. But it looked like a man. He was holding something up to his eyes like a pair of glasses that was made out of tubes. Binoculars, I said. What? Imelda and Sybil asked in unison. They're a tool, I said. It helps you see long distances. People use them to spot birds, watch operas, and occasionally to spy on others. We used to have spies in the castle sometimes, sent by some foreign regime or other, Tabitha added with an eyebrow waggle. They usually worked undercover, though not from a distance. It's very hard to gather information when you can't hear what's being said. Unless they have a bug, Sybil pointed out and then looked at me to make sure she'd used the right word. Right, I said. A bug. What happened when you caught the spies in the castle? Imelda asked with a zealous grin. Put to death, the noblewoman replied and shrugged. Usually hot oil or something equally painful. Maybe we could do that, Imelda said. First, I said. Aren't priestesses supposed to be all about peace and love? And second, that would be murder here in New Jersey. Maybe we could take him back to Lupercalia, Tabitha mused. Girls, Sybil said, and she slammed her fists on the table. Be serious. The person might be out there right now. Okay, I said and raised my hands. But there's another possibility. Besides a stalker in the woods, our forest is private property. Technically, nobody should be in there, but at the same time it's connected to a larger nature preserve. I know for a fact when we bought the house that there weren't any fences installed in order to protect the local ecosystem. So there's always a chance that some poor hiker or dog walker who was looking for his lost dog and you two got spooked and… That's not the end of the story, Imelda said, and she started to glow as she took a deep breath. The very next night we were inside the house eating hamburgers from Uber Eats. I want a hamburger, Tabitha muttered, and I shot her a look. We were up on your balcony, Hank, with our legs hanging out, Imelda continued. We thought it would be fun, but then a figure emerged from the woods. Okay, I sure as hell did not like the sound of wherever this was going. Shit, I sighed. What kind of figure? He only came up to the edge of the trees, Sybil added, and he held the binoculars up to his eyes and looked at us. We could see the shadowy figure, and we think he didn't know that we could see him, but then we waved at him, and the man disappeared. Pervert, Tabitha said, and Sybil raised her eyebrows at her. What movie did you learn that word from? The witch asked. I don't remember, Tabitha admitted, but I feel like it fits. I agree, I said. It is perverted, but I have a feeling that he wasn't only spying on the house to get a look at you ladies. What do you mean? Sybil asked. I took a deep breath and nodded. Even though I had no evidence, my instincts had gotten me this far, and I felt like they were good enough to carry me a little further. Right, bear with me here, I sighed. But as you know, Barney Converse from Joetown Coffee seems to love his illegal moves. Sure does, Sybil nodded. That pervert. Okay, let's stop saying pervert now, Imelda added in a more priestess-like voice. If we're being watched, this is a serious issue. Exactly, I murmured. I mean, we tend to literally appear out of nowhere. When we travel with the moon ring, that would definitely freak out a potential stalker. I mean, you have a pretty weird public reputation anyway, Sybil added. People think that you think you're a werewolf, and you are a werewolf, but they don't know that because werewolves don't exist here, I said, and suddenly I was struck with an idea. Just a moment, ladies, I need to make a call. Wait, do you guys have my phone? Sybil and Imelda exchanged a quick look before Imelda rifled through her sweatshirt pocket and delicately placed the smartphone on the table without passing it over. I looked between Sybil and Imelda, and Sybil grinned kind of nervously. Is something wrong? I asked as I looked down at the phone. Of course not, Imelda said, even though she glowed with mischief. I just want to remind you of something, Hank, Sybil said with a big smile. And that would be? I asked. I had no idea what these crazy chicks could possibly have gotten into while we were gone, but if they'd discovered other delivery apps, the possibilities were endless. I wondered what my bank balance would be, but then I reminded myself that the girls were the reason I worked so hard to maintain that balance, and I wanted them to have fun with it when we were in New Jersey. Okay, I said when no one spoke. Just tell me what you did. Well, Sybil continued, just remember that you love us. Like really, really love us. And that we're all in this together, and that most importantly we're a team. And how much money did you spend on Uber Eats? Tabitha snickered, and she leaned back and crossed her arms. Come on, ladies, I said as I looked between the witch and the priestess. Cough it up. I'm going to see the amount on my bank statement anyway. $2,433, Imelda said without looking up from the table. Imelda, Sybil said, and her eyes glowed green with magical energy. No, I laughed. I'm glad that at least one of you has a guilty conscience. Anyway, money is the least of my problems right now. I have more of it than I know what to do with. What I need to get to the bottom of is whether Joetown is trying to track my movements. Imelda shrugged at Sybil and slid the phone across the table like we were engaging in some kind of skeevy business deal. I took the phone and went over to the big glass screen wall that looked out onto the garden. After calling Ava's number, I pressed the door button so that the big piece of glass opened up, and I walked into the garden. The phone rang 3 times while I took a deep sniff of the air. With my super wolf senses, it was clear how different things smelled in Jersey than in Lupercalia. The quality of the soil and the way the sun beat on the concrete around our pool was just different. Hello, Hank? A familiar voice asked, and I realized just how relieved I was to hear her voice, even though she was my annoying older sister. Ava, I said. Thank God. Well, good to know you appreciate me, she said. But if you want to catch up about non-business stuff, you can always call me, you know? You spend so much time in your weird little hippie community in the Pine Barrens that this is serious, I said for what felt like the 50th time that day. I think that Barney Converse is up to some shenanigans. That guy is a sneaky bastard. But we told him we weren't interested in his offer, Ava replied. What else is there to do or say? I have a few ideas about what he might be up to, I said. Has there been anything strange on your end? Anything out of the blue? Ava took a few deep breaths and scolded her dog for eating some of the plastic wrap from the new couch she just had delivered before she returned to our conversation. Sorry, she said. Goldie likes plastic. But about what you were saying. Well, there were lots of door-to-door salesmen in the last few days. I wasn't sure if it was really odd, though. I mean, there's a lot of nice houses around here, so it's the kind of place where people would buy stuff. From a door-to-door salesman? I asked. Yeah, she sighed. Okay, I'll admit it does sound weird when I say it out loud. So what were these guys selling? I asked. I don't know, she said. I didn't pay that much attention. One guy had kitchen knives, I think, and the other guy had, Right, I said. Let me guess. They asked you a lot of questions. They did, she said. I mean, it just seemed like part of the pitch at the time, but now, I'm not so sure. What kind of stuff were they asking? I pressed. About where I worked and that kind of thing, she replied. When I'd moved, and where I was from. It was pretty exhaustive, actually. And what did you tell them? I asked. Nothing too personal, right? I obviously lied my ass off, she said. You think I'm telling some stranger About my life? There must be about 10 guys out there now who think I'm Cindy. From Indiana. I love that, I nodded. But I think they must work for Joe Town. The girls said that they saw someone spying in the backyard. What the fuck? Ava asked. But you guys are surrounded by a forest. You sure? It wasn't just some dumbass on a hike. He came into the pool area, I said. They saw him with binoculars. What a pervert, she huffed. Yes, but perverts aside, I'm going to get to the bottom of this, I said. Need any help? She asked. If any door-to-door salesmen come, I could always scare them in some way. Do something that they never would have dreamed, like inviting them inside and handcuffing them to the kitchen sink. Absolutely not, I said. Let me handle this. I'll let you know if I'm right. I believe in you, little bro, she chuckled. And don't worry if anyone asks. You're Mandy from Indiana, I replied. Cindy, she corrected me. Smell ya later. I hung up the phone and turned around where all three girls were standing in the kitchen and looking at me expectantly. What's going on? Sybil asked. Is she also being spied on? I think so, I replied. Just in a different way. She's had a lot of door-to-door salesmen show up since she moved in. That's horrifying, Sybil responded, and the witch shook her head. I couldn't think of anything worse. But it does mean one thing, Tabitha added with a grin. Now we get to scheme on how to catch that little shit who's been hiding in our forest. Oh, I do love to scheme, Sybil said, and she batted her eyelashes. What are we going to do? I don't know yet, I said. Give me a second. I'm sure I'll think of something. I just need to turn off my werewolf brain and activate Hank the local hero brain. That's so handsome, Imelda said in her light, dreamy voice, and I couldn't help but snicker. What about a trap? Tabitha suggested. What kind of trap? Sybil responded, and she wrinkled her nose in thought. Like a bear trap? That will show them. Guys, I'm not setting a bear trap for someone, I said. I'm a public figure with a high profile in this world. If I actually hurt someone, there will be a court case and a lot of bad publicity, especially if people think we set the trap deliberately to catch a human. And then there will be the eco-freaks who will hate us just because we have a bear trap. The eco-freaks do like their coffee, Tabitha sighed. We'd be hurting if we lost their business, I said. True, Sybil sighed. And we don't want the police to show up and ask a lot of questions. What if they tried to deport the three of us? Why would they do that? Imelda asked. It's complicated, I said. And I'm not sure they would, since you're all from the Pine Barrens supposedly. But yeah, we don't want the cops out here. We need to send a message that's covert, Tabitha said. But firm. Something that doesn't bring the authorities in. I'm sure I can think of something. Come from an old family where nothing is ever settled in public. One time we had pig poachers on our farm, Sybil added. It was terrible. They would stake out the property, and we'd hear the squealing at about 3 in the morning. But we didn't catch them until Charles put a blue blood shifter on the property to scare them away. What? He didn't even attack them? I asked. He just scared them? Yeah, she shrugged. What would you do if you're only a human and a giant hybrid wolf comes at you? Hubris isn't going to get you very far with a 9-foot wolf. They knew that we had the law on our side, and that we'd get them if they weren't careful. Yes, but that's Lupercalia, Tabitha added. This is New Jersey. We need to set some kind of New Jerseyan trap for him. I could scare him off, Imelda offered, and the blonde bared her teeth and hissed. In her sweatshirt and jeans she looked more like a teenage goth who was dressed for Halloween than an actual ex-vampire. Imelda, I love you, Tabitha sighed. And you're beautiful. But I don't think you're going to scare him away with your teeth. No, but maybe I could, I said with a wolfish grin. You mean? Sybil began and then hesitated as she looked at the other women. Change into your wolf form here? In New Jersey? I mean, it would be fucking terrifying, wouldn't it? I said as I imagined chasing the interloper through the fields. It would scare the absolute crap out of anyone to see that kind of creature in the woods. I mean, you get the occasional bear around here, but nothing like a 9-foot wolf. He's right, Tabitha shrugged as she looked at the other girls. He's completely right. If I wasn't a Lupercalian and I saw a giant wolf, I'd say my prayers. Oh, this is very exciting, Imelda giggled. This is Hank, you're going to scare him to death. Not to death, I corrected. That would be too much. But just enough that he runs back to Barney Converse and tells him he won't do the job anymore. And then I'll find Barney and ask him what the fuck he thinks he's doing sending someone out to my private property. Defiant, Tabitha said and nodded in approval. I like it. So when do we want to do this? No time like the present, I added. I'll go into the woods in my human form. And when I'm sure I'm alone, I'll change into my wolf form. Once I have his scent, I'll scare the shit out of the fucker. Fucker, Imelda added with a nod. Sounds like a plan to me, Sybil replied. It was time to track our stalker and show him just why nobody fucked with Sir Henry Baker of New Jersey. Chapter 11. Okay, Tabitha said as she trundled up the stairs. As much as I would love to watch this, I really need a nap. My stomach can't decide if it wants to eat or throw up again. That's fine, I said. We can eat when I get back. We watched Tabitha disappear up the stairs, and then we turned to the door I'd left open. The three of us watched the woods for a moment, but nothing moved, other than the usual squirrels and birds. What if he really is some guy who just got lost while walking his dog? Sybil asked. I don't think so, I said. A dog walker probably wouldn't have binoculars. And if he was a bird watcher, he wouldn't be watching the house, he'd be watching the trees. And he probably would have waved back, Imelda said. Okay, Sybil said and took a deep breath. You're probably right. He is the chosen of the moon goddess, Imelda said. I'm sure she guides his hand in all such moments. I trust your instincts on this, Hank. Thanks, I replied. And we haven't even told you about the notebook, Sybil said. I'm not sure how everything turned so upside down while you were gone. What happened with the notebook? I asked, and the two girls shook their heads. It's not the time for that now, Hank, Imelda said as she set her hand on my left arm. We can discuss that after you catch that fucker in the backyard. Are you sure? I asked. If it involves the safety of Lupercalia. Imelda's right, Sybil said. The stranger spying on us is the more immediate danger. Okay. I sighed and stepped outside. I'll be back soon. We love you, Hank, Sybil replied and waved. Love you too, I said. And don't order any more Uber Eats while I'm away. Wouldn't be surprised if Barney found a way to stalk us through those delivery drivers so he'd know when we were home. The air outside was cool, and I could smell a few whiffs of springtime in the air. I would have enjoyed it if there hadn't been a stalker in the woods, and the fact that I couldn't made me growl in anger. I made my way past the pool and stalked around the garden shed to see if I could detect anything unfamiliar. But even with my wolf senses I couldn't smell or hear anyone else nearby, so I took a deep breath and then shook my head back and forth. I'd never tried to change into my hybrid form in this world, and at first, nothing happened. I wondered if I'd finally figured out what I couldn't bring from Lupercalia to New Jersey, and if that were true it would really suck. I opened my eyes again and tried to take in deep breaths through my nose and out of my mouth. Okay, so this was completely new, but I had to get past my own mental block if I was going to make this happen. Hell, it couldn't be that hard, could it? I did it all the time in Lupercalia. Go back to the basics, I muttered. I closed my eyes again and thought back to Charles's first lessons. I imagined myself in my hybrid form with claws, hair over every inch of skin, and sharp fangs that could bite through almost anything. I thought about the view from 9 feet up, and I focused on what the backyard in New Jersey would look like from that height. And then I shook my head back and forth and tried my damnedest to become the thing I just imagined. It started slowly, like something was trying to block my shifting, but I could feel electric currents start to race through my limbs. After a few seconds, I realized that the surge of power was hotter than usual, and something about my body felt different than it usually did. But when I opened my eyes and looked down, I saw that I had changed out of my normal self and into my hybrid wolf state. At least my vision was as sharp as it usually was in my hybrid form, and I could clearly see Imelda and Sybil by the back door, where they jumped up and down and cheered. I gave them a salute with my paw and then headed into the woods. I had never been so aware of the wildlife in New Jersey before, but as I moved through the trees I had a new appreciation for my home state. The air carried the usual human-made sense of gasoline and pollution, but beneath that, I could smell the oak and pines, the dark soil, and the first wildflowers. Bugs zipped by me while birds sang to each other, and their trills were so loud in my ears that it was almost painful. Okay, I said and took a deep breath. I won't find this guy if I don't focus. It took a few moments, but I managed to ignore the birds and other critters and focus on what was odd or unfamiliar. I sniffed the air again and I could detect the scents of several people nearby, which I assumed were probably hikers. I definitely didn't want to scare any of them, but how could I be sure which one was our stalker without checking on each scent? In Lupercalia, the solution would be to pray to the moon goddess. I'd seen the power of the moon goddess for myself, but would she be able to answer a prayer? In New Jersey? There was only one way to find out, so I closed my eyes and tried to compose a prayer that the goddess could answer. Moon goddess, I muttered, give me a sign that will lead me to the man who has been spying on us. I felt the wind move around my ears, and a cool chill came over me. The various human scents were replaced with one distinct one that smelled like sweat, old coffee, and bad breath. Thank you, I whispered. The smell was coming from the northeast, so I patted in that direction while I tried to decide what to do when I found the guy. I could just leap out of the bushes and scare the bejesus out of him, but would that be enough? I needed to make sure that Converse didn't just send a bunch of guys out to investigate, so maybe I needed to do a little more. As I closed in on my target, I could pick up the scent of old barbecue sauce and cotton as well, which I interpreted to be a stain on his shirt. Couldn't believe how much detail I could detect about this guy just from my nose, though I certainly understood why animals seem to have such an easy time finding and avoiding humans. The ribbon of smell led me past a rabbit warren, and a pair of deer fled as soon as they caught my scent. The birds were careful to stay out of my reach, and even a possum scurried away when it saw me coming. But the scent of my target didn't move, and I soon heard the sound of something larger rustling around. It was trying to stay quiet, but to a wolf, it sounded like a giant thrashing around in a pile of leaves. I stopped behind a tree and a few scraggly shrubs when the source of the scent was just a few feet ahead of me. I held still for a moment just in case the man had heard my approach, but the rustling continued, so I knew he was oblivious to my presence. I peered around the tree where I was hiding and spotted an old log. The wood was starting to rot, but the trunk was large enough to hide anyone who might be watching the house. There was another rustling sound, and a moment later I saw a man sorting through a backpack. This had to be our stalker. He still had the binoculars around his neck, and he even wore the usual birder uniform of khaki pants and a white t-shirt underneath a camouflage shirt. There were a couple of stains on the camouflage, which I was sure were the barbecue sauce I could smell, but that wasn't the only thing that felt off about his birder look. It took me a moment, but I realized that the guy had thick chin stubble and enough supplies that he wouldn't have to leave the area for days. The leaves and grass were matted down like he'd been in the same spot for a couple of days, and he looked prepared to stay even longer. None of the local birders ever camped overnight, and they certainly never spent much time this close to the house because most of the more interesting birds were found deeper in the woods. I couldn't see a campsite, so I assumed that there must be a car or something around here that he was sleeping in when he wasn't encroaching on my property. I knew there was a small parking lot a half-mile or so away for the hikers, and though it was supposed to be closed after sunset, no one ever went by to make sure that the place was really empty. If he'd parked down there, he could easily spend his day out here making sure that my women were sufficiently freaked out. The last of the orange light dappled the ground of the woods and faded over the trees, and the spy looked up for a moment and glanced toward the house as he pulled a power bar out of his pack. He lifted the binoculars for a moment, maybe to check on who was there, and then tore open the wrapper. If I was a movie writer, I couldn't have scripted a better moment to make my first move. I lifted my head and let out a long, loud wolf howl that could be heard for miles. The world froze for a moment, and then my wolf ears picked up the sound of all the small creatures running for cover. The guy immediately jumped up and knocked over his backpack. A few Ziploc bags with old sandwiches fell out, as well as a few crushed bags of Fritos. The guy looked around frantically, and then he remembered his binoculars. He lifted them to his face as he scanned the horizon for any sign of a wolf. To his credit, the guy didn't run away. My wolf senses told me his heart rate had shot up, and he scuttled around his mini campsite as he tried to figure out which direction the howl had come from. When he didn't spot anything, I heard him take a deep breath, and after another minute or so, he sat down again. Sucker. If I'd been in my human form, I would have been grinning as I lifted my head. again and let out another loud, long howl. I even managed to make it sound like the howl was coming from a spot further away from the camp, and while the stalker might think the wolf had moved on, anyone familiar with the canines would imagine that it was another member of the pack responding to the first one. The guy's heart rate shot up again, and he made a muffled squeal that let me know he was now officially scared shitless. His breathing became more ragged as he snatched up the backpack and started to look around, and then finally, he stood up like he might actually make a run for it. I waited until he turned his back to me before making another move. I would be quick enough that he couldn't see me, but I sure as hell wanted him to hear me. All he would know was that something very big was in the woods with him. I counted to 3 in my head before dashing over to the next tree. It only took me one swift movement to get to the other tree, and the only sign that I'd moved was a faint rustling of the leaves. The man swung around so fast that he nearly toppled over, and his eyes were wide with fear. The wolf inside me was sizing up the best way to attack the guy, and I had to remind myself I was just there to scare him, not eat him. Still, it was fun to watch him stumble around as he tried to figure out where I'd gone. "Who's out there?" he demanded. He was trying to sound tough, but I could hear the quiver in his voice. When no one answered, he kneeled down and started to go through the backpack again. So I howled once more, and this time I sounded so close that the guy reached out to stop whatever was coming his way. I saw him look around, and when nothing appeared, he reached into the pack again. The sky burned with the final glow of the day when he finally found whatever he was looking for. He slowly pulled his hand free of the backpack and looked around one more time. Something glinted in his hand, and when he turned to face in my direction, I got a good look at it. He was holding a gun. Not a big one, but a handgun that was good enough to be a real threat to any person or creature that he encountered. He seemed to decide that he didn't need the binoculars to fire the gun, because he pulled them over his head and set them on the ground next to the backpack, all while he pointed the weapon in random directions. I locked eyes on the weapon in his hand, and suddenly my body was flooded with disgust. I could feel the fur on the back of my neck stand on end as I watched the guy raise the weapon and pointed at nothing more than a few trees. I shouldn't have been surprised, but it did piss me off. I couldn't believe he'd come out to the forest to spy on my home, and he'd done so with a handgun. That could have killed any of us if he'd opened fire. Maybe the guy was genuinely afraid that he'd run into a bear out here, but that didn't give him the right to put my girls in danger. And now that I'd seen the gun, I had to wonder just what his instructions were. Was he just spying on us? Or was there something more sinister going on? None of that mattered now. The only thing I cared about was that this was not going to end well for this little shit. I felt a smirk cross my wolf face as his heart rate soared even higher. The gun was not a comfort to him, which meant he probably wasn't a good shot. In fact, I was willing to bet the bastard would freeze up when he thought there was something very large and angry charging his way, and even if he did get it shot off, it would probably go wide. It was time to give this guy exactly what he deserved. I waited until he pointed the gun toward a small rodent that was digging through the underbrush. At least he didn't open fire, though his trigger finger trembled as he tried to decide what to do. I leaped from the shadows with a growl, and the man was so stunned that it took him several precious milliseconds to even turn around. I knocked the gun from his hand before I even landed, and I heard it land far enough away that he would never find it. My own feet touched the ground with a heavy thud, and the man finally swung around with his fists raised. He struck a pose like a boxer, but as his eyes kept drifting upward to my face, his small shred of determination fled, and all that remained was his fear. "Who sent you?" I growled as he started to hyperventilate. He breathed before I started to get a whiff of something pretty nasty. I took another few sniffs before realizing that the man had quite literally shit his pants. Whoa, now this was truly a moment for the Hank Baker mythology. The man looked up at me and hyperventilated a few more times, but I was getting sick of him and his literal shit by then, so I growled as I bared my teeth. "Who sent you?" I demanded, and then howled so loudly that the sound wave nearly knocked him down. He took 2 stumbling steps back, and then he grabbed up the backpack and started to sprint in the opposite direction. It wasn't hard to follow his escape route because he made more noise than a charging elephant. I howled again just for good measure, picked up the binoculars, and then went to search for the gun. The last thing I needed was for some kid to find it and shoot himself, so I headed in the direction where I'd heard it land. At least the scent of the gun was easy to follow, since nothing else in the wood smelled like cold steel and oil. I had to dig it out of the bush it had crashed through, but once that was done I was ready to head home. The sky was a hazy blue by then, so nightfall wasn't far behind. I stuck to the thicker areas of the woods where no one ever ventured, since it was always possible that someone would decide to investigate the howls and barking, but the forest remained quiet after my little display. As I bounded for the clearing that led to the backyard, I started to smell the chlorine from the pool. That stuff was a lot stronger with my wolf nose, and I felt my eyes start to water. It was probably a good idea to change back anyway, since I was about to be exposed to anyone who might be looking in our backyard. I stopped long enough to shake my head, and after another brief struggle to shapeshift, the strange feeling of contorting in several directions at once finally came over me. Opened my eyes to find I was just regular Hank again, in his jeans and his sneakers. I didn't know why it was a little harder to change forms in this world, but at least I knew I could do it if I had to. I stepped out of the woods and walked across the backyard with the gun and binoculars. I could see the outline of all three girls just inside the glass door, and as soon as they saw me they ran outside. "Hank!" Sybil yelled as she took the lead. I noticed that she'd taken a shower, and her hair was back in 2 black braids. She looked so damn cute with her braids and her big pink t-shirt that I couldn't get over it. "Look what I have," I said, and I held up the binoculars and gun. He had it. Backpack too, but he took that with him. "Is that a gun?" Sybil asked. "It is," I said and nodded. "Seems our stalker was a lot more dangerous than you realized." "It's a good thing you chased him off then," Sybil replied. "We just need to make sure it stays that way," I said. Chapter 13. I leaned back in the comfortable leather chair of the dining table, where I had perched my laptop and the steaming cup of moonbeam brew that Sybil had brought me. I took a sip of the brew and felt its heat re-energize me. This stuff was so damn good. Of course people and corporations were putting their life on the line and embarrassing themselves for a taste of the good stuff. "Tell me if you find a funny one," Tabitha called from the kitchen, where she and Sybil were trying to teach Imelda how to make pancakes. "I sure will," I called back with a sigh. I knew that this was going to be a pain in my ass, but I had to get through. It's not like I had some boring desk job that required me to sift through emails all day, so one day of administrative work in order to keep my company going seemed like a small price to pay. I opened the first email, which was from Polly, the head of marketing at Joe Town. I hadn't trusted her since the day I'd met her, though that was largely based on personal reasons and so not completely fair. She found out where Ava and I had grown up and had mentioned going to the Lamberton School, which was where all the hyper-rich commuter families sent their kids. Our good old public high school always had a beef with Lamberton, and I could just tell from a single look and sniff that she was just another privileged kid whose dad had landed her the job. "Dear Mr. Baker, I'm circling back in after our meeting a few months ago just to check how things are going. Look, Hank, I know you're a fellow North Jersey kid, and from one fan of Delmar's Deli to the other, I just want you to know that I have your back. Here at Joe Town we got word that you're not going to accept our offer. Big sad face. We just want to not just double but triple check that you know the benefits of this type of merger. The cash at closing will be significant, but the shares of Joe Town you'll receive will ensure generational wealth." I quickly deleted the email without even glancing at the remaining 3 pages. I didn't have any damn time to listen to more sales speak about this terrible deal that Ava and I had already refused. I clicked on another email, and this one was from an unknown email address. That was nothing but a string of numbers. "Great. That looks super legit. Dear resident, we've received reports of an unfamiliar animal on your property, and we were wondering if we'd be able to investigate. Visitors to your grounds have sent in reports of a large human-like dog stalking the woods." I immediately both reported and deleted the email. It had obviously been sent from a burner email, and I knew that no good would come from engaging with whatever moron was operating the server. Before I could open the next email, I heard the sound of ducks quacking, which happened to be my personal ringtone for Ava. "Hey Ava," I said when I answered the phone. "Hey Hank," she sighed. "Has anyone from an unfamiliar number called you today?" "No," I replied. "But I got an email that was obviously from a burner account. Have you had any more weird shit happen at your place?" "Yeah, I have," she answered in a droll voice. "That's actually why I'm calling." Okay, I laughed at my sister, who'd adopted my mom's lecture voice. Well, are you gonna tell me, or what? Some idiot said that there was a weird dog seen prowling around your grounds, she said. Like, the police apparently got a report from some hiker in the woods near your house that there was a giant dog or something, and since you weren't answering your phone, they called me to ask if you had a large dog, because of course there's no dog license for your address. Sounds like the guy who sent me an email, I said. He wants to come search my property for some mysterious big dog. So did the police tell you anything else? Well, when the officer wasn't snickering, he managed to tell me that this guy came in and reported a dog on your property had tried to attack him, Ava said. But then he claimed the dog could talk, was like 10 feet tall, and had giant fangs. Jesus, I muttered. Look, I know you've been selling this whole werewolf story, she said. So, was this some sort of publicity stunt? Not on my part, I said. But, can I call you back later? Think I might know who's behind all this. Sure, she said and smacked her gum. Just keep me updated. I ended the call just as the girls arrived with 4 plates full of awesome-looking pancakes. Before you ask, it's blueberries and strawberries, Tabitha said as she set a plate in front of me with a silver fork. The noblewoman sat down beside me and started to spray whipped cream from the can all over her pancakes, while the other 2 women sat down across from us. I guess I should eat, I said as I pushed my laptop away. And I am pretty hungry after last night. So what's the plan for today? Tabitha asked through a large forkful of pancakes and whipped cream. Sybil and Imelda sat down across from us and started to eat their breakfast in a significantly more dainty manner, even though neither of them were technically nobles. I think that it's about time that I confront Barney Converse in person, I sighed. He'll just deny everything if I call him on the phone, and I don't have any proof he hired this guy. But if I can see him, I'll know if he's lying. Are you sure he's in town? Tabitha asked. I read in one of the magazines that he has dozens of homes all over the world. He does, I said. But luckily they've been on my ass so much that I know exactly where he is. Look, I got this a few weeks ago. I pulled up an email on my laptop, and the girls crowded around me. Dear Mr. Baker, as a prospective part of the Joetown family, we'd like to invite you to the grand opening of our 500th location. 500. Now that sounds like something to celebrate to me. We're going to be popping the cork on some bubbly, eating some delicious treats from Baked by Marnie, and of course, sharing a taste of our brand new 500 roast to celebrate. We'd love to see you there to share a moment over a nice cup of coffee. Warm wishes, Barney Converse. That little shit, Tabitha murmured. So that's what he's up to. Well, it won't be too hard to find him, I sighed. The address is in Lower Manhattan. I can drive in now and take the Lincoln Tunnel to get there. Do you want us to come with you? Sybil asked as she lifted her eyebrow. We can always be some scary backup. I can hex all the coffee and give them explosive diarrhea. That's disgusting, Imelda murmured as she shook her head. I don't want to think about explosive diarrhea. I didn't bother to correct her because I simply didn't want to talk about diarrhea anymore, because then I'd be singing that stupid song I learned in 4th grade for the rest of the day. I'll be fine, I said. You girls can hang out here today and plan the weddings or whatever. I'll be back in time for dinner for sure, and maybe even earlier if I can get this settled with Barney. Are you sure? Tabitha asked. I'm sure, I replied. We can talk about the notebook when I get back. Sybil and Imelda exchanged quick looks and then nodded, and Tabitha stopped eating long enough to stare suspiciously at the 2. But we finished our breakfast in relative quiet, and then I kissed each girl before I headed into the city. I'd taken the trip quite a few times when I was a kid, mostly with my parents, when they would take us to a Broadway show, a special exhibit at one of the museums, or my favorite, the Bronx Zoo. I still found the energy of the place to be exciting, and I always felt like the poor country cousin whenever I found myself staring up at the latest skyscraper. But I barely noticed the bustle and traffic on this trip. All I could think about was the creep who had been watching us, and how I had to be sure there would be no more stalkers in the woods around my house. I found an overpriced parking garage a few blocks from the new Joetown, parked the Jeep, and walked the rest of the way. I knew I'd found the right spot when I spotted a large crowd gathered outside as they waited for their turn to place their orders. I nodded to a few of the people in line and then Showed the bouncer at the door the invitation I'd printed out before I left. The bouncer nodded and opened the door for me, and I stepped into the familiar wood-paneled and bamboo walls that could be found at all Joetown locations. This one was also decorated with giant balloons shaped like coffee beans, and men in business suits milled around while they drank a selection of either champagne or coffee from the standard Joetown coffee cups with the green logo of a steaming bean. I will never let our place look this tacky, I muttered as I looked around the shop. The place stank of cheap espresso, and there were even some rich-looking girls in the corner taking selfies in front of the coffee bar. I didn't even know it was humanly possible for Joetown coffee to be cool, but it seemed like they had a lot of money and they wanted the influencers to be there. "Excuse me, sir," a man said behind me. I spun round ready to take on whatever paid muscle Converse had sent over to remove me, but instead I found a friendly-looking guy with black hair holding a silver tray of drinks. "Oh, hi," I stuttered. "Would you like an espresso martini?" he asked and gestured at the small, non-martini glasses filled with an ice cube and brown liquid. They'd been fashioned to look like whiskey, and I had to admit to myself that they did seem kind of appealing. "Sure," I sighed, and I took one and swigged it down in one go before slamming it on the tray. "It's, the new coffee recipe from the new brewery," he said as he stared at my empty glass. "Thanks," I said as I turned my attention back to the crowd. The waiter shrugged and moved away, and a moment later I heard him offer the same drink to another new arrival. The place was noisy, and even though it wasn't that large, it was hard to pick out individuals from the crowd. "This guy should be easy to find," I growled. "Just those awful ties alone should stand out." But there was no sign of the fat man with brightly colored ties in the crowd. Frustrated, I closed my eyes for a moment and pictured my target, from his balding head to his beady eyes, and even his shit-eating grin. Suddenly, I felt like my body was pulling me to the left. It was the same feeling I'd had when I asked the moon goddess to lead me to the stalker, and I knew that she was guiding me once again. I waded through the crowd toward the bar, and as I neared the faux wood counter, I spotted a very large man moving toward me. The crowd parted to make way for his obese body, and I saw that today he was wearing a bright purple suit. In fact, it was almost the same color as Barney the dinosaur, a creature I'd hated as a kid, even though Ava adored the show. And there was a bodyguard right by his side. "No problem," I said to myself. "I can handle whatever this fool dishes out." A lady near me glanced up, and something in my expression must have warned her, because she quickly hurried across the store toward the exit. A few others dodged out of my way as well, but Converse didn't notice me until we were only a few feet apart. The fake smile he wore vanished as soon as he saw me, and he shot me a frightened look with his beady pig eyes. Converse whispered something to his bodyguard, plastered his smile back on, and then suddenly turned around and started to shove his way to the back of the store again. There was a pair of silver doors with small round windows at the back, which I guess led to their storage and kitchen area, just like we had at our place. The coward was trying to escape rather than face me. "Is that the Hank Baker guy?" a girl in a pink sequin dress whispered to another influencer as I squeezed by. "Yeah, it is," her friend giggled. "He's so cute in real life. Didn't they do that whole feature on him in the Times?" "Yeah, he said he was a werewolf," the girl in the pink dress replied. "He certainly looks rugged enough to be a werewolf. But in a good way," her friend sighed. I smiled to myself. I could only hear them because of my werewolf hearing, and I was getting a kick out of that. I decided to flash them a look, and both girls blushed. One of them had bleached hair that had been dyed pink, and another wore long braids down to her knees that had been dyed gray at the end. Whoever they were, they looked trendy, and once again I wondered how much money Joetown had paid them to be there. When the girls grinned and giggled, I nodded at them one last time and then turned to find my prey again. I saw Converse push his way through the doors, which was fine by me. I was angry as hell at the man, but that didn't mean I wanted an audience for what was about to go down. I elbowed a few more people out of my way, ignored the complaints from the crowd, and stormed through the doors like an avenging angel. I found myself in an industrial kitchen that looked like the inside of a submarine. Everything was polished steel that looked like it had just rolled off the assembly line. More importantly, I spotted Barney Converse and his bodyguard by the fire door. That served as the back entrance. But the door was apparently locked, which didn't surprise me. Converse was just the kind of guy to lock the emergency exit so he could be sure his employees weren't sneaking outside for a smoke. Give up, Converse, I growled, and I heard the man's heart rate soar as he froze in place. Step away, sir, the bodyguard said as he turned around and came toward me. He had a shaved head and was wearing sunglasses, and Converse breathed easy for a second when the man stalked toward me. But the muscles looked like the kind you get from lifting weights in a gym, and the suit was cheap and ill-fitting. This guy looked intimidating, but his fighting skills were probably minimal. As the guy stopped in front of me, I reached out and grabbed the t-shirt he was wearing under his polyester blazer with my left hand. His glasses flew off, and I watched his eyes widen just before I delivered a haymaker to his jaw with my right. Bone cracked under my fist, and the man gurgled as he tried to jerk free of my grasp. But I was too strong, and I chucked him to the side like the annoying pest he was. I heard his head crack against one of the silver countertops and a tooth fall to the floor, but my eyes were locked on Converse. Hank, he said as he pawed at the door. Hank, how's it going? Why are you leaving your own party, Barney? I growled. Looks like the fun is just beginning. Oh, of course, he jabbered, and his eyes turned to focus on something behind me. I turned around and saw that the bodyguard was starting to stagger over. This wasn't really something I was in the mood for, so I walked over to the man, grabbed his blazer, and hit him with a haymaker that was hard enough to whip his head back. I saw the guy's eyes roll back into his head, and when I let go of the fabric, he crumpled in a heap on the floor. All right, Converse, I snapped as I turned back to the CEO. I'm not in the mood for this shit. Just tell me what the fuck you did and why. Just a little intelligence gathering, he replied. Companies do it all the time. That doesn't make it legal, I said. Who was that guy in my backyard? A private investigator, he replied. He's usually very reliable. Is he dead? Who? I asked, and then realized Converse was staring at the body behind me. He's fine. He'll just have a really bad headache when he wakes up. You might want to take him to the hospital to get checked for a concussion. Oh, Converse huffed and flapped his hands. I don't like hospitals. Fine, then tell someone else to take him, I snapped. Now tell me why you sent someone to spy on me. For all the reasons that someone would hire a private investigator, the petulant CEO sputtered. To get information about the competition. And then what? I asked. You were going to pressure me into selling the company to you. He didn't say anything right away, but the greedy look that lit up his face was confirmation enough. He seemed to be gathering his thoughts, and when he finally found what he wanted, he lifted his chin like he'd found a way to beat me. You keep wild creatures on your property, he declared. Animals that are dangerous to anyone who... I live in the woods, you idiot, I replied. I don't know exactly what your guy saw out there, but I'm guessing it was a bear. It wasn't, Converse protested. Okay, let's say it wasn't, I cut in. If you start telling people that I've got giant talking animals on my property, what the hell do you think will happen? I'm the werewolf guy after all. Converse pondered that for a moment, but he wasn't done yet. You also have several women who live on the property, he said. So, I said and shrugged. They like being there, and I like having them there. They're free to leave if they want, but as long as they want to stay, I'm more than happy to spoil them. Everyone knows that already. Which wasn't entirely true, but enough people knew about the girls that it wouldn't be a big deal if Converse decided to go public with the information. Well, he stammered as he racked his brain. Let me put this in terms you'll understand, I said. If you try anything like this ever again, I will sue your ass, and I will make sure you're bankrupt by the time I'm done with you. Now, you can either leave me and mine alone and keep your company, or you can keep harassing me and lose everything. I understand, Barney, Converse whispered. Don't fuck with me, Converse, I warned. I don't care how much money you have. You're corrupt, and you're a fat sack of crap. And your coffee tastes like ball sweat. The businessman blinked at me a few times before silently nodding. I kind of couldn't believe I'd said that, but I didn't care. Their coffee was bullshit compared to mine, and I was well on my way to dominating the entire market with my moonbeam brew. I'm sorry, he started to say. Don't, I said and shook my head. I know you're full of shit. And stop sending me those saccharine emails about the joys of being part of Joe Town. They're driving me nuts. Of course, he agreed and nodded. I'm not a fan of those myself. I glared at him until I heard his heart rate go up again and his lips started to quiver. I wasn't sure if the fat bastard would actually leave me alone for the rest of my life, but for the moment we would have some peace and quiet at our Jersey home. I nodded once, glanced at the bodyguard, and then turned my back on the fat CEO. The doors barely made a sound as I waltzed back into the party as if nothing crazy at all had happened. I mean, tackling bad guys was just another day at work for me, but that was in Lupercalia. In this world I was just another average guy who happened to strike it rich with the world's best coffee. The place was even more crowded than before, and I was rapidly losing patience. As I tried to muscle my way to the front door, I felt a tap on my shoulder. When I was about halfway there, and I growled as I turned around. But instead of Converse, I found a lithe, tanned girl with red hair and lots of freckles. She was wearing a purple t-shirt and flared jeans, and she smiled up at me with bright blue eyes. "Hey," she said. "I'm Jessa. I just wanted to say that I read your interview in the Times and I genuinely thought it was genius. I know that this might come off as like a little too sincere, but I think you're just as much of a performance artist as you are a businessman." For a second I just stared at the girl before I shook my head and then flashed a smile. "A performance artist?" I laughed. "Well, I've never been called that before. But thanks, Jessa." "No problem, Henry," she said with a giggle. "I work in a coffee shop and we all think your werewolf story is really fun." "Thanks," I replied. "Well, if you're ever in Jersey, stop by. Maybe I'll even change into a werewolf for you guys. And call me Hank." "Okay, Hank," she said with a smile. My angry mood melted away, but that just made me want to get home even more. So I smiled back, and then started to push my way through the crowd again. Though at least I said excuse me before I nudged someone out of the way. The smell of hot piss and hot dog water hit my nose as soon as I stepped outside again, and I shook my head at the familiar odor. New Yorkers always said that New Jersey smelled like shit, but that had to be an absolute joke. My backyard smelled of pine cones and serenity, and even though I loved the Big Apple, it smelled like Yankee Candle 4th Circle of Hell edition. Gotta love New York. I chuckled as I headed for the parking garage. As I walked along the sidewalk, I thought about Jess's comment. I really had created not only a lucrative business but also one of the most impressive backstories in modern business history. It seemed like I was gaining profit and notoriety for my character as well as my coffee, and if that meant that I was a performance artist, then so be it. I was not going to pass up a few extra bucks because someone thought it was just part of an act. On the drive home I called Ava to give her an update, but her phone was off and went straight to voicemail. I didn't know when I'd get another chance to speak with her, so I pulled over and sent her a long series of text messages to explain everything that had happened to catch her up. By the time I rolled back into my private driveway, it was well into the afternoon. The sky was clear and blue, and as I looked across my property I felt my shoulders relax and the tension of the day fade away. The city was fun, but it didn't even compare to all the natural beauty and space I had out here. I parked the Jeep and gave her a little pat before I walked toward the front door of the house, which flew open before I'd made it up the first step. "Hank!" Sybil squealed, and the witch flung herself at me. She wrapped her arms around my neck and tightened her legs around my waist. Took her under her bottom and swung her around, which made her cute little braids fly through the air. "Hello, you," I murmured into her ear, and she kissed me on the cheek. When I put the witch down, I noticed that both Tabitha and Imelda were standing in the foyer and looking a little hesitant. Imelda was shifting her weight between her 2 feet, and Tabitha was pacing around and shaking the can of whipped cream in her hands. "I'm so glad you're here," Sybil said, and the green-eyed witch looked up at me and gave me a weak smile. "What's going on?" I asked. "I can feel the weird vibe all the way down here." Sybil led me into the house and shut the door after me. The other 2 girls walked up to me and took my hands in both of theirs. "Hank," Imelda said, and for the first time in a while she didn't seem to be glowing at all. "Hank, there's some very serious things we need to talk to you about." I looked up at Tabitha, who just nodded in agreement. Holy shit. If Tabitha wasn't cracking any jokes about what was going on, then I knew that I was in some pretty serious hot water. "What is it?" I asked, and Sybil took a deep breath and stared up at me. "It's the notebook," Sybil said. "We've managed to make a lot of progress, and that's good, but just prepare yourself, Hank," Tabitha finally added in her low, husky voice. "Prepare yourself for some dark knowledge."